At the end of this story, I want you to go down in the comments and let me know what you would have done if this horrific thing would have happened to you. Hello and welcome to StoryVault. Now, I'll just be upfront, for the few of you who have been wondering where I've been for the last few months, I'll just be honest with you. Making these videos takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and it was getting a little bit discouraging that you spend like 30 hours making a video and it winds up getting like 100 views and only about 3 people watch it all the way through. But of course, that's no reason to quit, and so I just decided to take a little break over Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's to kind of recharge, and now I'm ready to get back into it. And I know this video is probably only going to get 7 views in the first 24 hours of being posted, but it's okay. I really appreciate all 7 of you. So anyway, happy late New Year. I hope all of you guys had a really good holiday season. And today I want to tell you guys a story that was actually suggested to me by a subscriber. He sent me an email a couple of months ago, and I actually was just going through looking for story ideas for today's video, and I came across his old email and I thought, absolutely, I'm definitely going to do that. So if you're watching, this one is for you, and if anybody else has any story suggestions that they think I should cover, you can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, or send me an email, and I will get to them. But back to our story. As I began to research this case, I realized this was actually one of the strangest and more creepy stories that I've ever covered, not necessarily because it's particularly gruesome, but I always find special significance in those cases where it seems like there's almost no motive whatsoever. It's like this thing just happened completely out of the blue. And it's those kind of stories which I find the most sinister, because it really does give you that feeling that this could in fact happen to you. So with no further ado, let's open the vault. This is the story of Bill and Dorothy Wacker.
I am here to tell you a story that will torture your thoughts by day and poison your dreams by night.
The emptiness will haunt you.
So our story takes us back to the year 1984 and to the small town of Maliciously, Ohio, into the home of a couple named Bill and Dorothy Wacker. Now, Bill and Dorothy were about as typical of an elderly couple as you could hope to meet. They were both born in the 1920s, and Bill had actually served as a soldier in World War II. And by the time the events of our story pick up in 1984, Bill was 64 years old and his wife Dorothy was 57 years old. And so this couple was just a peaceful old retired couple living in this little house in Maliciously, Ohio, which was the same house that they had lived in for their near 40-year-long marriage. So one day, Bill and Dorothy were out about town doing their weekly shopping and just doing some things away from the house, when to their horror, when they returned home, they found out that their house had been broken into, and when they walked into the house, they realized that their home had been completely ransacked. There were broken dishes in the kitchen, furniture was flipped over. It was as if somebody had gone into their house looking for something, but the Wackers had no idea what anybody could have been looking for or why somebody would have broken into their house. And the strangest part about this was, though their home had been gone through and ransacked, it didn't really look like anything of value had been stolen. So they were confused and upset by this, of course, but at the end of the day, there was really nothing that they could do at that point, so they just kind of cleaned up their house and replaced all of the broken property and tried to just get back to their lives. And so that's exactly what they did. They went about putting all of their stuff back together and replacing the things that had been broken, and they spent a lot of time and money getting everything back to the way it was, and then just tried to put the incident behind them. But later on the same year, once again, as they were out and about town doing their shopping, they would come home and find that their house had been broken into once again, and that their home had been completely ransacked for a second time. And once again, it didn't look like anything was stolen. It was as if somebody had just broken into their house, gone about destroying a bunch of stuff, and then just left. Bill and Dorothy didn't notice anything had been taken. And the Wackers had no idea what to think of this, because they had been living in this same neighborhood, in this same house, for the last 4 decades. And in that entire time, they hadn't experienced any significant property damage, and none of the other houses on the street had been getting broken into. It seemed like whoever was doing this was only specifically targeting Bill and Dorothy Wacker. So once again, Bill and Dorothy go about their house and get everything cleaned up and replace all of the broken property. not really knowing what else to do at this point. But unfortunately, after just a couple of weeks had gone by, they would come home yet again and find out that their house had been broken into and ransacked for a third time. And so at this point, Bill and Dorothy would go to the police and explain to them what had been happening. And the police would go about conducting an investigation to try to figure out who had been terrorizing this couple. But after weeks of investigating, there was really nothing the police could do because, like I said, nothing had been stolen, so they couldn't track any stolen items, and there was no real way for the police to figure out who had been breaking into this house. So there was really at this point nothing the police could do except maybe set up surveillance and wait for the guy to come back. But of course, the problem with that was these break-ins and ransackings had been taking place sometimes weeks apart and sometimes months apart, so there was really no way to tell when the guy would come back, and the police wouldn't be able to dedicate that many resources into just watching one home for an entire year. So really at this point, there was nothing that the police could do. And so of course, Bill and Dorothy were just totally on edge, not knowing what to do, knowing that at some point, there was a pretty good chance that somebody was going to break into their home and try to destroy their property, and there was nothing that they could do about it. And fortunately, over the next few months after the Whackers had gotten the police involved, everything did appear to be really quiet. Nothing seemed to happen. There was no more home invasions, and it really did seem like, to the Whackers, that this whole ordeal could possibly be over. But the Whackers were not out of the woods yet, because it was about this time that Dorothy would actually start to have some serious health complications, and she would actually have to go to the hospital to get heart surgery in the summer of 1985. And luckily, her surgery went well, and then one day in July of 1985, while Bill was out of the house and Dorothy was kind of at home, just sitting in a rocking chair, resting and recovering from her heart surgery, Dorothy would hear a knock on the door while she was kind of resting her eyes. So Dorothy kind of slowly got up out of her armchair and walked over to the front door to answer it, and when she opened the door, she saw there was a young man standing there, and he said that his car had broken down a little bit down the street, and he asked if he could come inside and use her phone. And of course, Dorothy said, "Sure, absolutely, no problem. Go ahead and come on inside and I'll go get you the phone." So as Dorothy turned her back to the young man to walk back inside and to go get him the phone, she felt an excruciating pain in the back of her head as the young man hit her in the back of the skull. And before Dorothy could do anything, her whole world went black and she collapsed onto the floor. And when Dorothy finally woke up, she found that she was tied up in her own kitchen, and she had no idea how long she had been passed out for or what really was going on, and she had no idea where the young man was who had attacked her. So slowly, as Dorothy was tied up, she began to kind of drag herself through her house until she got to a window, and then she began banging on the window and screaming as loud as she could until some of her neighbors actually heard her, and they came over to her house, unlocked the door, and helped Dorothy get untied, and then Dorothy and her neighbors together would call the police and report what had happened. Now, Dorothy was extremely terrified and, of course, totally shaken up at what had happened, but Dorothy was not seriously injured, and this time, their house had not been ransacked, and nothing seemed to be destroyed around the house. Instead, what this appeared to be was more of a robbery, because whoever had broken in and attacked Dorothy and then tied her up in the kitchen had proceeded to go about the house and pick up random things to steal. Bill would later tell the police that whoever had gone through his house and attacked his wife had made off with an antique watch, a revolver, a radio scanner, and a few other random items before leaving the house without doing anything else. Well, almost anything else. What they did discover is that whoever had broken in and attacked Dorothy and tied her up had actually taken a crayon and written on the wall in her living room a message that read, "Cheaper, but will do." Now, it's nearly impossible to tell what the intruder meant by cheaper but will do, but it seems to me, of course, that whoever was doing this realized that the Whackers probably couldn't afford to keep on replacing all of the broken stuff when he would break in and ransack their home, so this was an alternative to where he could do something to harass the couple that would totally terrify them, but I suppose he was doing them a favor because, after all, this was more affordable. Like, okay, did he think he was doing them a favor somehow? But that's just my theory. Dorothy said that the man that came to her door was somebody that she had never seen before. She didn't recognize him at all, but she was able to give the police a description, so they were able to actually make a composite sketch of what this man could possibly look like. Dorothy said that the man who had attacked her was a white guy about 5'9" in his 20s with blonde hair and blue eyes. So now, Bill and Dorothy were not just nervous about their house being broken into and experiencing property damage, but now whoever was harassing them had now upgraded to assault and violent crime. But on the bright side, after this recent attack, the police now had something to go on. Not only did they have that composite sketch of what this guy could possibly look like, but they also had that list of items that Bill had given them of what the guy had taken from the whacker's house. So the police launched an investigation and they started going to local pawn shops and street dealers to try to see if this guy had tried to offload any of the stolen items, and they thought that maybe they could use those items to trace back to the person that they were after. But unfortunately, after weeks of searching, nothing ever turned up. It was as if this guy had just taken these items as kind of like trophies. It didn't seem like he had taken them to make any money off of them. But this is where this story starts to get even stranger. For the next few months after Dorothy had been attacked, everything was quiet again. There was no more attacks, no more ransackings, their house hadn't been broken into, everything was pretty quiet for a few months. But then, after that few months had gone by, Bill and Dorothy and some friends were actually hanging out in their house when all of a sudden Bill heard a knocking on their porch. So Bill walked over to the front door and he opened the front door to see who was on the porch when nobody was on the porch. But when Bill looked down, he saw a package on his front porch. And so he walked over to the package and he picked it up. And what do you know? Inside that package was the revolver that had been stolen from his house months earlier. And that's why the intruder had taken these items, so he could use them to further taunt this elderly couple. And over the next few months, all of the items that this man had taken slowly began to show up on the whacker's porch one by one. And so for Bill and Dorothy, this was even more terrifying because yeah, they weren't being assaulted and they weren't having their home broken into, but if these were just property crimes and robberies, at least that was like normal criminal behavior of somebody breaking in to steal something. But now it was officially clear that whoever was doing this was doing it for no other reason but to taunt and terrify this couple. And after all of the stolen items had been returned, the whackers started to receive these menacing phone calls where somebody would call up their house and start talking to them in a creepy voice and taunting them. Whoever was doing this began to call the whacker's house, and whenever they would pick up the phone and it was one of these calls, the man would speak to them in this creepy, menacing voice, threatening them, or sometimes he would just breathe deeply into the phone until they would hang up. And while all this was going on, sometimes when Bill and Dorothy would be in their house, Bill would hear random knocking on their porch or knocking on the side of their house. But whenever he would go outside to see who it was, there was never anybody there. And Bill even went so far as to install a big light in his front yard as security, so his whole yard would be illuminated in hopes that whoever was coming up to his porch and knocking on his house and then running away, he hoped that because he had this light that he would be able to catch a glimpse of the guy as he got away. But he never saw the guy. But the day after he had installed that security light in his yard, Bill did hear a knocking on the porch, and when he went out, there was nobody to be seen, but what he did see was a note left on his front steps, and the note had said, "Your lights are a laugh." And still, Bill and Dorothy had nothing really to do, and they continued to report all of this behavior to the police, telling them every time they would receive a phone call and turning over all of the notes that had been left for them. And the police even ran handwriting analysis on these notes that were left. But the notes that were left for the whackers looked like they had been written in the handwriting of a little child. And the handwriting expert who was looking at these notes actually told them that whoever had been leaving them was probably writing with their non-dominant hand. And this was how he was obscuring his handwriting, so it was completely impossible to be traced to him. And so all of this suspicious behavior and these threatening phone calls and these random knockings on their house continued to happen. Sometimes he would go weeks between visits, and sometimes everything would be quiet for a few months. But just as they thought he had gone away, he would always come back. And this strange behavior went on for years until in 1993, Dorothy was attacked again. This time, the attack was pretty much the exact same as it was the last time. Bill was away from the house, Dorothy was home alone when she heard a knocking on the door. When she came to the door, whoever was at the door knocked her over the head and Dorothy was unconscious. But this time, Dorothy would actually suffer a fracture to her skull and she would have to recover at the hospital. And still, the police had no leads whatsoever. They had no idea who was harassing this couple. They even went up and down the street questioning every single neighbor and asking if they had seen anything suspicious or anybody who seemed out of place, and every single neighbor said they hadn't seen anything. And one might think, after multiple ransackings of his home, and after all of this suspicious behavior, and even after his wife had been physically assaulted twice, that Bill would consider moving away. But both of them actually said they didn't want to move away.
Well, as far as all this harassment is going on, which to me it looks like it's trying to force us to move. Why should I move? Why should we move? Why should we be forced out by a kook? To me, that's what it is a kook. I'll not do it. I'll stay there, protect our own.
Bill said that this had been his house for nearly 50 years and he wasn't going to be scared away by some stalker. And after Dorothy had recovered from her skull injury and had returned back home, Bill and some of his son-in-laws actually decided that they were going to stake the place out. So they left Dorothy inside the house, and then Bill and his two son-in-laws would get in parked cars, and Bill got in their camp trailer across the street, and they all just kind of watched the house to see if this guy would show up. But of course, this didn't work either, and after hours of sitting and waiting to see if anybody would show up, eventually Bill and his son-in-laws called it quits and they went back inside. At this point, it seemed like whoever was doing this was just a complete ghost. Except it wasn't a ghost, because almost immediately after they had gone back inside, so they had this whole elaborate stakeout, they were all watching the house, and then they all call it quits, they go back inside, and as they all go back inside, almost immediately they hear a knocking on the front porch. And so as soon as Bill hears this knocking, he stops what he's doing and he runs to the front door and he bursts out of the door to see if he can see anybody. And of course, he sees nobody. And he looks down, and what does he find? Yet another note. This time the note read, "Get the message." Whoever was doing this was obviously just having fun toying with this elderly couple. Get the message was apparently meant to mean it doesn't matter what you do, you can call the police, you can stake out your own home, I can still get to you. And perhaps the most infuriating part of this story is, this is pretty much where it ends. After Bill got that last message that said, "Get the message," that was the last thing they ever heard from the stalker. But you can imagine, they didn't know it was over. They would go for weeks and months and not hear anything, and they were probably just waiting for him to come back at any moment, but he never did. Bill Wacker eventually passed away in the year 1999, and then later on, in 2010, Dorothy would pass away as well. Police never found out who had harassed this couple for years on end. And really, they had no suspects whatsoever. They never found anybody who seemed to match the description that Dorothy had given to the police of the man who had attacked her all those years ago. And after this final message, everything just kind of went cold, and eventually the couple died and the case was never solved. But let's be serious. What do you think? Could it have been Bill all along? I mean, of course, this wouldn't explain who had attacked Dorothy and the description that he gave. Maybe Dorothy had been in on it and they had just done it for attention, but that all seems really far-fetched as well. And Dorothy was seriously injured both of the times that she was attacked, so it's pretty unlikely that she had anything to do with it. And for the record, Bill and Dorothy both denied ever having anything to do with it.
He says, we got to explore all possibilities. She says no. Which, why should I do something like that after being married 48 years, you know?
This case was really interesting for me to research, and I really have no idea who the culprit could have been. But I'm more interested to see who you think it was and what you would have done in this situation. Like, okay, your house gets broken into 3 times. Then your wife gets attacked twice. She's tied up, she's in the kitchen, she's got a fractured skull. I mean, at that point, if it was me, I would just move out, like, honestly. But I get it. You've lived in the house for 50 years, you don't want to be scared away, all of that. Okay, sure, whatever. But I mean, it's like, at least like get a dog or something, right? Like that was what I was thinking the entire time. Like, why does this guy not have like 6 big dogs in his front yard, right? I don't know. Super suspicious. Really, it's unsatisfying because we have no answers. So what do you think? Thank you for watching, and thank you especially to the 7 of you who stuck around to the end. If you are one of those people watching this right now, go down in the comments and type the number 3. Just like nothing else, just type 3 and just see. I just want to see how many people actually watched to this point. But anyway, thank you for watching. I'm glad to be back, and I will see you next time. But until then, be safe out there.